Hey everyone, and welcome back to Joey's Retro Handhelds. I'm Joey, and today we're going to take a look at the MagicX Mini Zero 28. It is this little mini right here. Let's start this one off strong. They actually did it. They made a device that I'm probably actually going to use. They made a good mini device, which is something that we have struggles getting in this community. And so let's talk about why this is actually pretty good. The MagicX Mini Zero 28 is MagicX's third release now, and to say they've had a rocky start would be a bit of an understatement. For all intents and purposes, this new device is an entirely new MagicX with virtually no connection to the previous devices, and for good reason. There was quite a bit of drama with their previous releases. Basically, MagicX released their XU Mini M a few months ago. They advertised the device as having an RK3562 processor and DDR4 RAM, and instead it actually had an RK3326 processor, which was less, and DDR3 RAM, which was also less. They actually had the exact same scenario happen with their previous release, and that was the MagicX XU10. So it became a pattern, and twice sucked. So long story short, we are back here with MagicX's new device made by a new supplier, and it is an entirely new MagicX. And so this MagicX is completely different than the previous MagicXs, so I'm willing to give them a pass here. Okay, so let's talk specs on this. There are three colors, black, purple, and glacier blue. And there's a starting price of $55 for the 16GB version, which has been sold out for a while now. I think the more realistic price is $59 for the 64GB version, and I wish they would do a no SD card version for like $50 or something for a pretty specific reason. This runs Android, and it is different than most Android devices that you're aware of. It's actually running off of the SD card. That means there is no internal storage that has Android. It is all booting right off of the SD card. Speaking to Gamma, creator of Gamma OS, he basically said that you would want a fast SD card in this scenario. And thankfully, MagicX actually does include a Kioxia branded SD card. And that has been more than fine in my testing. Obviously though, I prefer my own SD cards where I can, but they went the extra mile here and included a good branded SD card. Now, before you turn off, there likely will be Linux custom firmware support down the line, from what I've been told, and I've spoken to well-known custom firmware in Linux, and they are working on this, so it is coming. However, as you know, I only review based off of current day, not based on potential. Potential is a gross and potentially misleading word, because things can happen in the future. Things can break down. Things could just go a different way. And especially in a scenario like our hobby where things change rapidly, where you might in the next month see an Ambernick release that defeats this one, potential is just dangerous. So based off of today, there is no list Linux custom firmware that's available to you as a public, but the Android build is actually pretty good. This video was sponsored by flexispot. Do you play your retro handhelds on the floor? Maybe you're playing on a couch, but the coffee table is a little too far away. Or maybe you actually play at a desk, but it doesn't move, so it's a desk from the 1970s. Thanks to today's video sponsor, flexispot, you can have the best of all worlds by sitting down to play your games at a proper desk and standing with that desk when you want to get some blood flowing to those legs. That's right, today I am pushing you to play games and promote proper posture. Do as I say, not as I do, and all that sort of thing. flexispot's E6 Max desk is a 3-stage standing desk. It has height adjustment for kids, adults, and even extra tall people, which I am not. Just pretend I am not short for this video. It's also super sturdy, and it can handle up to 352 pounds of weight, or more than 2 Joeys if we're using me as a metric. I couldn't find another Joey for this video, and also stop trying to guess my weight. Being an electric standing desk, there is a programmable control panel for you to lift the desk up and down. And you have 4 height memory settings, so you don't have to remember where you like your desk height to be. Save that thinking space for something else. Throw away that boring desk you have and pick up a flexispot E6 electric standing desk instead, linked in the description. This display is a 2.8-inch 640 by 480 4:3 aspect ratio IPS display. There is an all-winner A133P processor inside, and that is the same one that the TrimUI Smart Pro and the Brick use. So theoretically, we should have actually the same or better performance, and I say better, as Android tends to be better for Nintendo 64, for example, whereas usually Dreamcast is better on Linux. But this also has 2 gigabytes of RAM, where most other devices are only using 1 gigabyte. Now, I've said this so many different times, but in my opinion, you don't want to buy this for Nintendo 64 or Dreamcast or PlayStation Portable. Those are at the top end of what this is going to play, which means that you're going to run into a lot of issues, and having to deal with trying to get Nintendo 64 games to work or Dreamcast or PSP is just not very fun. And especially nowadays where other devices are doing those systems at $125 or so around there, it doesn't make sense to spend most of your time finicking with those systems to get them to work here when they'll just work on other devices and you don't have to worry about it. But if you do want to try and get those systems, Nintendo 64 or Dreamcast, PSP, to work, you can get some games running on here. PSP is going to use a lot of frame skip. Nintendo 64, you're going to have to dump down the resolution, all that sort of thing, but it could be a Sunday project if you want it to be. Now, I mentioned it before, but because this is Android, this actually has 2 gigabytes of RAM. It has Wi-Fi, but no Bluetooth. There's a 2900 milliamp hour battery inside, and that's kind of about it. I have to say, MagicX actually really surprised me here. When I said I was critical of MagicX's last release, I meant it. I went really hard on them. The plastic used on that device was bad. And actually, it wasn't even fitted properly either. The headphone thing was just bulging out and all sorts of issues. The software was another extremely bad thing, and it was locked down quite a bit. The speakers had quite a bit of distortion, and it had no Wi-Fi or anything like that, and it was the same $50 price. The D-pad and buttons, they felt fine, but they were a bit on the cheap end. The screen was actually really nice as well. Never mind the added drama from the wrong processor and the RAM, so there was a lot going on. But like I said before, they actually listened to feedback, because they seem to have solved all of that with this release. I don't have the original XU Mini anymore to compare, but the plastic here at least feels or seems a lot better than the first XU Mini M. And they have done a lot more work on the software end, and we're going to talk about that. And the speakers sound better, and this actually has Wi-Fi. They did a lot of work here. Credit where credit is due, they kind of pulled a reverse Miu here, and they're getting better over time instead of worse over time. The D-pad and buttons are both on the smaller end. They're definitely not normal sized, but they're also not the smallest I've ever reviewed. They're somewhere in the middle, and it fits nicely with this small little device. Honestly, I do wish they were bigger, because I'm always going to wish for that. I know they're mini devices and a lot of things have to be mini, but controls are the one thing that I still want to be normal sized when you make a mini device. I kind of look at the Retro Pocket Mini as an example of that, where the device shrunk, but everything is still big in it, if it makes sense. Like, you're not giving up anything when you shrink the device. But in this one, they had to make changes. The buttons are smaller, the D-pad's a bit smaller, all that sort of thing. And it's actually pretty good. Now, the D-pad itself does have some sharp edges, and it can be tricky in some scenarios to hit Hadoukens, for example, just because of how small it is. But otherwise, I do find it to be okay and serviceable for this device and how small it is. On the buttons end, they are actually very quiet buttons. There is no real noise to them, and they have nice travel. Still a bit on the smaller end here. I wish I had the 28XX to compare, but I have a feeling they're pretty close to that size, if not somewhere in between the 28XX and the 35XX. On the sticks front, they are similar to Retroids, at least the cat part, and honestly they feel pretty nice. My only use case for these would be hotkeys. I don't see myself playing any of the systems, like I mentioned before, that would use sticks, although some of you might, and in that scenario, they are actually in a nice spot and they feel comfortable to use. The shoulders and triggers are curved to the device, and they don't stick out too much, which adds to the pocketability of the whole thing. One small nitpick that I find is I find the shoulders and triggers to kind of blend together too closely, so sometimes I'm trying to hit the trigger and it's hitting the shoulder button instead, and that doesn't feel too good. Then we come to our very first big sort of negative, and it is the USB-C port. You might be wondering, what could possibly go wrong with a USB-C port? And the answer is they recessed it way too far in. I actually have some cables that don't go far enough into the port, and it is a shame. And then I do have some cables that do work just fine. However, they are by the slimmest of margins connecting, so it doesn't feel great either. I've had a few users that have bought this device and they've come up to me and said that, hey, they can't even charge it with the cable that comes with the device, and that's not great. So there seems to be some level of differences between these devices, some level of quality assurance that isn't going well, and that's not great. So I'm hoping they do fix this. Now, the USB-C connection obviously matters a lot for charging, but also because this is Android and it is running off an SD card, you can't just pop off the SD card, connect it to your PC, and load your games that way. It is entirely different when Android is running off the SD card. You can't see those files and folders. What you have to do is connect it to the OTG port, a USB-C cable, to your computer, and then it just shows up as any other Android device and you can move your files and folders that way. So it is a bit different. You're going to be using that USB-C cable often, especially if you want to do it not wireless and you want to just transfer files over using a cable, but it's not a great thing to not have that port easily accessible with any cable that you want. Okay, let's get into the software now because I think that's where this device actually really shines. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is Android, it has no touchscreen. How good could it possibly be? The answer is surprising. They actually put in a lot of work here, and they're going to get the praise for it. When you boot up the device, you are put right into their front end, and it is called Dawn Launcher, and it is essentially a Daijisho clone. You can access your library, obviously, see your games and all of that, but you can check the settings on a per system basis. You can adjust the CPU mode for power saving, balanced, and performance. You can change the emulator core being used. You can turn on and off overlays and even integer scaling. There's also screen scraper integration to download your artwork. Navigating the front end is actually pretty easy. You use a combination of the shoulders and triggers and buttons to just move around. Now the app screen mirrors the usual Daijisho app screen, and you can see them all there. You should be aware there is no Google Play installed here, and it looks like there are some pirated emulators, unfortunately, so you're going to be relying on sideloading a lot of your own APKs, or installing something like the Aurora store to get any updates. You might be wondering how you can sideload APKs and other emulators, and there's a Chrome browser, and if you click on the right stick, it shows a mouse cursor, so you can use that to navigate around. You also need to use that same cursor to type on the keyboard, unfortunately. The G button on the bottom of the device is your back and home key, so you use it quite a bit. It also acts as the menu button in RetroArch and emulators, which is nice. Now, one very cool thing about this front end is how it handles ROMs. By default, with the SD card they include, there is a ROMs folder, and inside of that is all of the system folders that are already created, based on what looks to be Emulation Station's naming convention. But what if you want to use your own SD card separately? You can pop into the Dawn Launcher, select your game library directory, so your ROMs folder that you create on your new SD card, and it'll create all of the necessary folders that you need on that SD card so you can just pop your ROMs into those folders and off you go. It basically just goes the extra step of creating your SD card for you, essentially, and all of the folders and structures that you need to make it simple on you, just to put your ROMs wherever you need to put them. I could do an entire video on just the software, but needless to say, it is actually very simple, and there's advanced ideas too if you need them. However, I should mention that a lot of these features and functions are alpha or beta. Some don't actually work, some work sometimes, and all that sort of thing. But enough of them do work to not be a hindrance for anybody to just get up and play some games. Now, personally, as great as all of that is, I can't believe I'm actually going to say this as somebody who loves Android, I think MUOS or Linux custom firmware would be the right choice here going forward. That's not to say that the Android side isn't perfectly capable, because it absolutely is. You could easily play anything that you want on here. It just feels like at this screen size, at this everything, Linux seems to be a better option. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I know MUOS at some point will be coming to this, hopefully, again, potentially. And I think at that point, that'll change a lot of different things. So if that is what you're waiting for, if you were waiting for Linux, if you don't want to screw around with Android, then you might want to wait a little bit longer. But as of today, with Android, this is a perfectly capable device and it actually is really good. It's just wild that out of every manufacturer and device out there, MagicX is the one that actually put in the work on the Android side to get it to be better, which is cool. On the screen and audio front, the screen gets super bright, but it doesn't get very dim at all. It seems to be a few notches above where it should be on the dimness meter. It's the exact same scenario on the audio front. This gets very, very loud, but it doesn't get quiet at all. I think they need to tweak some of the percentages and ranges here because it should be able to go lower on both audio and screen. But on the audio front, it is actually pretty good, and we do have stereo speakers, which is good to see. It is definitely better than you would expect for the price, but nothing too crazy. So let's have a quick listen. On the battery front, I went with a normal test usage of just playing Super Nintendo. And so we are at 100% brightness, 10% audio, Wi-Fi on, and I was able to get 343 minutes out of it before it died. That is just under 6 hours. I then did the exact same test with the lowest possible brightness, and I saw 450 minutes. So about 100 minutes extra in battery life, and that translates to about an hour and a half. The screen itself seems to be using a ton of battery, especially at full brightness, but both 6 and 7.5 hours are good results for battery life. Now, on the battery front, there is something important that I need to mention, and you probably saw it right away. The sleep drain is crazy. I spoke to Gamma, who has a build out for Gamma OS, and he sees about 10% drain on his build. I'm using stock here, and I'm seeing about 16% drain. This is in sleep mode over a 24-hour period. Now, in my tests, it went somewhere around 10 to 16%, 16 being the worst, but it just kept happening. So there is definitely some sort of sleep drain, sleep bug, whatever you want to call it, that is affecting this device. And it doesn't seem to be on the OS because it's happening on the Gamma side as well. So hopefully this is something that can be fixed, but I don't know what that fix is. Okay, so let's talk performance here, and I mentioned it before, but this is the same performance as devices like the TrimUI Brick and the Smart Pro. It is the same processor. But also, like those devices, this also gets warm to hot while you're playing. This always seems to upset some people, the discussion around heat and how hot devices get, but it is something that needs to be mentioned whenever it applies, so we're going to talk about it. Now, for me, this mostly applied to a lot of the higher end systems. And when you have Wi-Fi on and all that sort of thing, it gets to get pretty warm and hot, and it can get uncomfortable in some scenarios. I know there's a lot of people that are going to buy this and they're going to want to play Nintendo 64 or Dreamcast or PSP against my suggestion, and you can play some of those systems, but I think more of the issue than performance is the heat that it generates. But again, performance is hit and miss like it is on the TrimUIs. This is usually the spot where somebody's like, it plays it all perfectly, and they don't realize that auto frame skip is on and all these little hacks are on to get those systems to play, and then it's missing textures and missing glitches, all that sort of thing. So no, it is not a great way to play those systems. You can play some games just fine, but again, I wouldn't suggest it. I think the point being, at a 2.8-inch screen, to avoid heat and to match the nice size of this device, my usual statement of PS1 and under for this stands. Play some Super Nintendo, play some Game Boy and Game Boys, play some Genesis, all of that. There is hundreds and hundreds of games that you can play and that fit for this device. When playing Super Nintendo and below, I didn't feel the heat as much or at all, especially during my battery testing. I would constantly go and check on the device and it didn't seem to get warm or hot, which is a good thing. With this screen, all of those games look great and they feel great on the device with these controls and everything. It is a nice combination and it is easy to see why this is one of the better mini handhelds. Let me sort of wrap things up because this is getting to be a very long video and is longer than my usual reviews are. Is this worth your money today? The answer is absolutely yes. Even with Android and the amount of work that they put into the Android side, this is easily a device that you could just pick up and go because again, it is Android. You can throw it into sleep mode. You don't have to worry about it. You just pick up, play, go, play some games, all that. And they did the work here. If you want, you can install Gamma OS instead. There is a build available for it, but the default scenario here, if you just want to pick up a device and start playing with it, this works really well for that. If you want to wait for Linux custom firmware at any point, whenever that's coming, then do that too. My point being is that today the handheld is good. In the future, it could be great, but it is good enough that you can purchase it today. Now at $55 US, it is the priciest of the mini handhelds by far, but it also offers the most. So it's going to be a toss up onto what matters to you. The Anbernic RG28XX is a good device to a lot of people, but the missing sticks, the missing Wi-Fi make it a non-starter to me. The MIUI 30 is a fine device at $30 US, but it is a good device because of the price. It isn't a good device because it's a good device. This is a good device and all around. So again, you're going to pay more than the A30. You're going to have to wait on a Linux custom firmware, but I think overall in the future at some point, this is going to be the best option available to you. Obviously going to eat my words in a month whenever Anbernic comes out with their next mini, but I think right now, today, this is a really good purchase. So easy recommendation for myself. Android on this is still good. I will personally wait for Linux to go that route whenever that happens, but it's surprising that MagicX actually turned this all around. That is the one thing that I think I'm going to leave this with is they're coming, I guess. They're actually putting the effort in, they're putting in the work in, and it is surprising to see. So awesome work by them. This is a good handheld. I can easily recommend it. That's going to be it for this one. Don't forget to like and sub to help the channel grow. Come join me on the Discord to talk all about retro handhelds like this one. Support me on Patreon if you like my stuff. And hope you all have a good one.